was born in Detroit, but I wasn't home a lot. All through the elementary schools over at St. Francis de Sales, northwest side of Detroit, and it was kind of unique and privatized, I guess, to some degree. And Mom and Dad migrated from Quebec. Mom was registered, or always told me she was number 17 of 17 kids. Can't imagine that. I spent a couple of times there in their farm as a youngster, but she couldn't speak English when I was a kid, going to preschool and first grade, and she'd speak French, which was reflectively good because I could speak enough French to get by in some places, Alsace, for example. But you go to Paris, what the hell are you talking about? At any rate, went through elementary school there and got involved in stuff that I think led in part to the priesthood. I really liked one of the young priests there who would coach us baseball and stuff like that, and became altar boy. We had mass every day at school there, at that particular school. We were taught by nuns, IHMs, out of Monroe. And, but in high school, college, and postgraduate work, I boarded away from home. It was always away. And hardly ever spent any time at home, even in the summertime. In the summertime, I worked at camps of one sort or another. Ozanam, over in Lake Huron near Port Sanilac, or CYO camp near there. 4 summers over here at Camp Santa Maria between Elmira and Gaylord, and 3 summers in the cemetery. It wasn't home that much, but both folks were really good people. Though Dad worked his tail off. He was a finished carpenter, foreman, layout man. Built a lot of houses in Vincetta Boulevard and Royal Oak, beautiful houses. And he was always working. He was either, in addition to physical work, he was with the architects and with the customers, and so he practically ran the whole company. But it wasn't his company. 2 of those years, he took over the whole thing because of the boss, the owner, went to jail for 2 years for tax evasion. But he ran all of that, and he did well. He died rather early, and Mom's coming from the farm she came from. It was really a commercial farm. They had animals on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from local farmers. The kids would kill the animal, and then the grandpa, with one of his sons, would take all that into Quebec City and sell it to the butchers. And so Mom knew something about butchery. She only had a 3rd grade education, but when my dad died relatively early in his 50s, Mom became a butcher at Kroger's. And then after about 4 or 5 years there, she remarried one of my dad's brothers, an uncle, who was the mayor of Lévis, Quebec, retired. They were both in their 70s. He had 10 kids, but they were all out of the house. And they ended up with a beautiful spot right on the edge of a cliff overlooking Chateau Frontenac, Quebec City. And just a big window there. They spend their summers there, but he was wealthy. He had a place in Fort Lauderdale, and they would spend their winters there. In fact, after he died, Mom continued living there by herself and driving all the way to Florida on her own. She was in her late 70s. You know, Thanksgiving time, at that time, my wife Nadine and I were living in Detroit. She would spend 2 or 3 days there and then go on the trip. But one day, and maybe I mentioned this before, I got a call from the police department in Guelph, Ontario, which is right on the 401 going to Windsor and Detroit, driving. And something happened with the car, and they took perfect care of her, took care of everything. It was beautiful. But they said, we also found a loaded pistol in her glove compartment. She never had a gun in her life that I had any knowledge about at all. But I think she carried that to go from Detroit to Florida in case somebody stopped. You know, she would show them. They weren't even bullets. They found out later on they were just blanks.
Oh, my goodness.
Anyway.
But what year were you actually born? 34?
Yeah, 34. Okay, 34. October 4, 10/4/34.
All right.
Yeah, it'll be 89 this October, right?
Yeah. And so you said that like you had admired this priest who was active in the sports, and you worked at the summer camps. And what year did you actually, so in high school, you started to think about the seminary? Is that when they sort of?
Well, I was at the seminary in high school, 4 years of high school there. college. That was all
Was
seminary.
it St. John's?
No, that was Sacred Heart on Chicago Boulevard on Linwood. It's still there, yeah, but now it's a full seminary. The first 5 years was in River Rouge. Spent 5 years there. They had a high school. Spent a lot of time with high school kids, sometimes teaching stuff and being in charge of athletics, football teams and stuff like that, basketball. And on Friday nights, most every Friday night except some of the summer, they had a dance hall where I had to make sure that anyone coming in was from there, but the kids from outside weren't allowed to come in. They kind of trained that. And met some, we had little theatrical people that came in and out and became more famous later on in life, perhaps. And you would get someone like Gordie Howe in those days. For $25, he'd come out and spend dinner with them and give a talk and all that kind of stuff. Today, you got to pay somebody, a few $100, and he's not going to be there for dinner. He just comes in and talks for 10 minutes and gets out. Anyway, that was for 5 years there, and then the rest of the time, that went all the rest of the '60s, the last 5 years of the '60s, and all of the '70s, and back and forth, just the beginning of the '80s. In the inner city, Mac and St. Jean. And the Chrysler Corporation went from Jefferson Avenue all the way up St. Jean to where we lived, Mac Avenue. We had 2 elementary schools, one in Warren, St. Margaret Mary's, and one on Mac. St. Margaret Mary, we couldn't afford it. There was no money coming in. And the one on Warren converted to a thing during the Johnson administration where the feds paid to use that space to teach guys how to work in a factory. And they would get jobs there. The one on Mac Avenue turned into kind of a homeschool. It didn't cost anything. Mothers in the area would run it for preschool kids and so on things. And then the high school had to close. And that's when I got into, I knew something about construction because of Dad's job. The Ford Foundation gave me a 1-year grant with FCA, Foundation for Co-op Housing, which was in Chicago and in Detroit. But the first 4 months, they put me in the HUD building in Washington next to the White House. Lived there for 4 months. And
this was still while you were in the priesthood?
Yeah.
Yep. Huh.
And because we got into rehab, and I think it was a program. We ended up with 23 to 25 guys living in 2 old convents. There were no nuns there anymore. And most of them were framers who knew how to swing a hammer and knew the entrails of these old houses that were foreclosed mortgages at FHA. And FHA, HUD, gave them to us almost for nothing. And in almost 4 years, we did 117 houses, all new HVAC, whole kit and caboodle. But they sold under the subsidy programs that don't exist anymore, 235, 236. And I learned a lot about that when I was at HUD for 4 months. I mean, you'd sell houses with 2 or 3 bedrooms in it, anywhere from $90 to maybe 120, 25 on a 30-year takeout mortgage, P&I, T&I for 30 years.
Yeah. So
impossible. None of that exists. Nobody believes that today either. But it was true because
there's somebody just wrote a book about the $100 house they bought in Detroit that they had to rehab themselves though after they bought it. But yeah, it's kind of crazy. So that was while you were still in the priesthood. And then when did you?
In the period we lived there in the same, the old convent and stuff like that was empty.
Yeah. And then what year did you transition out of the priesthood and how did you went then into some construction?
Around 72, 73. After doing it physically, building the housing, we got into it digitally. Well, the digital stuff, and hired, who was with me for 10 years, was Father Joe Hopkins. He's dead now. He's buried there at Columbia. He had 2 PhDs. One was a double E, and he was working full time in what is now known as Microsoft. He really genius. And he had access to the biggest computer in those days, I think, in the whole city of Detroit at Wayne State University. So he developed a lot of these programs based on the knowledge of the guys working in the fields with the rehab kind of thing. So then we were able to do that in a manner quantity surveys, cost estimates, regression analysis for appraisals. I became a realtor, not because I sold anything, but you take a test for that. And that allowed us in all the cities that we worked in, and they were 2 to 5 year contracts with HUD in New York, Detroit, Chicago, Illinois, Seattle, Atlanta, Philadelphia, 9 different cities, including Coral Gables for 2 years, where Mom had a little Fort Lauderdale apartment there. But anyway, metanoia is the word that just goes through all of this for me. So how the hell all that happened? Metanoia is a Greek-derived word you may know of in English. It ends with OIA. No one pays much attention to that. But in Greek, it's a Greek-derived. It means a change in your life, usually a spiritual change that alters that. In English, it's almost any kind of a change. And as I look back over 88 years, all this, how the hell all that happened? All those changes. I don't know why. They did. The time that I left, I think once we got into the digital stuff on a real high volume basis, what we were doing in rehab, we turned all over to the Diocese of Detroit. That whatever money was involved in that, they got back. And this one, we didn't have any money to start with, in fact. But once we got into it, it paid a lot. And the guys would write the specs in those on houses that were assigned them from HUD, and the specs would go back to them. And being the realtor again, that allowed me to get all the sales data in any of those cities that the salespeople maintain. You know, if they had 2,000 house sales in a certain year, they collect all of that, and that's part of it with different statistical areas, and we put it in our computers, or we did, Joe did, and they would be able to do the quantity surveys without particular. The guys that worked in the field knew housing; they didn't know sales. Anyway, that was sent back to HUD. And they would say, okay, do one of 3 things. Rehab it as is, or tear it down, or sell it as is. And they would send their contractors to us, approved by them. We would let the contracts out competitively on a volume basis, sometimes 10 to 20 different houses, individual contractors. They do the work, we made the inspection, our guys did, and then sent it back to HUD for payment. They would make the payment and they'd pay us. To start with, it didn't have any money, but we did some houses that the money was coming in for us in a matter of a month or so. And there was a lady lived, I forget the name of the street, it's in Grosse Pointe, and her fence line from Jefferson, her neighbor was Henry the Deuce, Henry Ford. And his fence line went all the way down along her fence line property. She was wealthy. She had 2 tennis courts in her backyard and a pool. And I got to know her when we were doing the rehab work physically. She was on a board, some parish near us, that was doing kind of the same thing, providing housing from Veterans Administration, foreclosed. And she had 17 customers. She was on a board there, and they would pay the rent that the Veterans Administration would demand. And she found out what we were doing, selling the houses at less than what they were paying rent for. And she asked if we would take over those 17. We did. It took a while, about 1.5 years, because we had to find other places to live for them. And then did the houses. And it worked out that way. But anyway, I got to know her somewhat in that relationship.
And that helped then when you didn't have any money.
When I needed the money and the other thing, the digital stuff, I went to her. Holy crap. She took out her grocery checkbook and wrote a check, this is way back early 70s, for $55,000. And she says, it's 5.5, pay me back when you can. And as it turned out, we did a lot of volume, and we started getting paid within, I forget, 4 months or so. We paid her all back. Yeah, it was all done.
So it was worthwhile for her. So, but when did you meet Nadine? And where does she come? Where was she in that?
Yeah, Nadine for 22 years was a Felician nun at Madonna University in Livonia. She had a master's degree in home economics from Wayne State University. And that's her office was right upstairs.
Right.
Office. At any rate, 22 years she did that. And the last year that she was in the convent, and we had all Felician nuns at St. Bernard's who closed that high school and so forth, and in the elementary school that we converted to the Johnson administration thing. So the nuns are all gone, except that last year, 4 of them were reassigned to our area, and we put them in another house, the first house we had rebuilt. As a matter of fact, it was kind of a research place. And they were, the superiors that had them change their habits. You know, they had the old habits were down to their ankles, and they were wearing kind of regular dress stuff that mainly to.
I remember her telling me about this.
She did?
Yeah, because she said it was 1 year of that.
The ability was to interrelate with the people because they weren't teaching anymore, and they didn't want to scare them away with these big robes or whatever. And that's when I met Nadine. She was there at our place. We kind of liked each other, I thought. And that was pretty much it. And after that year, she was given the option of not doing that anymore or leaving. She left. And she taught at a school.
I remember saying she'd have to go back into the big robes and be cloistered again. And she told me about that because she just said, you know, after being a year.
Yeah, she didn't want to do that anymore.
Right.
And taught at another high school north of Detroit. And then shortly after that, I was going to leave. I asked for laicization. It's a process that priests can leave and become laicized back into a laity and not active as a priest. And it took me 2 years to get that. And I had started it a little bit before that. And the last 6 months, I left the parish area where I was known by the people living there because I didn't want to give them a sense of scandal or anything of that sort. And I spent the last 6 months with the Jesuit professors at the University of Detroit. I forget the name of the house that they all lived in, a building there. And in the interim, I found a guy, a Benedictine, to take my place. And that was unusual without coming out of the diocese. And he did. He moved into the rectory where I used to live. And then I left when the laicization came about. And I bought my first house, built in 1929 and pushing 5,000 square feet. And it was right on the Detroit Golf Club, where the PGA has held the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, Marie was talking about that.
But in addition to that, the 2 people who owned that house were a husband and wife, no kids. Both of them were getting a divorce. They were both psychiatrists. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, I got it for a heck of a deal. So it was a deal I could do. And we lived there for a few years, and I was a member at the club. And we're doing that digital program that so if this thing flies, who knows? It may not. If it doesn't, we all lose. If it flies, everybody gets a piece of the action. So we broke up started the corporation. Everybody got a piece of the action stock. And that went on for 10 years plus after. I left after 10 years. You know, I flew in here in 78, bought that lot right on the water, 110 feet on the water, West Bay. And built a house in 80. We lived there for 13 years before building the first building here in 93. Anyway.
Are there any like dating stories when you were courting Nadine you want to share?
Well, you know, on Friday as Catholics, it's not, in those days you wouldn't eat meat kind of thing. But we really sacrificed, you know, a lot. Like going to, what's his name? I forget.
Chuck Muir?
Yeah, Charlie Muir on Gratiot Avenue over by the east. We go there on Fridays, you know, and really sacrifice with a big piece of lobster or something.
Right.
But we like to also go out to dinner at, there's a restaurant in Windsor. And after about a year of dating, we met there, and I had made arrangements to have a table in Windsor at that restaurant right by the fireplace. We sat by the fireplace and we were chatting and so on. But anyway, I proposed, and I did it in French to start with. And she says, "What did you say?" And I told her, and you know, it was accepted, and we got married. And I got married in a tent outside where we lived on the golf course there in the back lot. And 3 brother priest married us, and that was it. We took our honeymoon. The only time I've been to Mexico, we went to Guadalajara, Acapulco, and Mexico City. And that was the honeymoon. Came back, and we were in our early 40s, as you probably know, and we were really, really lucky to. Nadine had Marie Chantal, who now runs the company. Nadine was 46. You don't have too many after that,
right? Yeah. Yeah.
So does that give you an overview?
When did you go to Europe, and what was the original intent when you went to Europe? And how did you transition from all of this construction work into wine? And
well, that was the 10th year of that digital company with quantity service and all that. And I wanted to get out of it. Well, I did. In fact, in 80, I built a house over here. And until 83. In 83, I wanted to get out, close. And my first payment for the stock that I owned was a year's salary, but no work. So that was in 83. And we went to Europe for 8 months. The first 4 months were in Alsace, right on the Rhine, Germany, but on the French side. And I could get along there with my French. In Paris, it didn't fly. But in Alsace, it did.
How did Marie Chantal's name come about? Like how was that all?
I'm not quite sure. Nadine was pregnant, and we knew it was going to be a girl. And among other things, visiting with an older couple, a friend, a close friend. We were at their house, and we were talking about that because she was pregnant, going to have a child. And I think, well, I don't know. I'd like Marie. And I said, well, yeah, I was just thinking, if we get involved with, can we have something French related to that? So we hyphenated her first name, Marie Chantal. Chantal has a kind of a French overtone to it, I think, winery stuff and so on. And that's how that ended up. That's all.
Yeah. It's just one of those, you thinking about it when you're. So, I know that you were living here in Traverse City when you started seeing property. Is that how you chose this area?
Well, no, we were living here to start with. I used to fly an airplane. Then we flew in here in '78, bought that lot. So in the latter part of '83, this place was for sale. 60 acres of cherries. Gores were the owners, but the president of Cherry Central, Minima, somehow owned it. I don't know. The Gores were pushing in their 90s, even donated the land for the Methodist church over there. And so they were really good people. And they had a great farm here, even involved in inventing the shaker, stuff like that. Nice, good night. Anyway, we bought it. The price was incredibly good. It was all 60 acres of cherries. So we farmed cherries for 5-6 years, but every year take out some trees with this objective in mind. First plantings right out here, Chardonnay and Riesling up to the top. That was in '86, so it's 36 years ago. They're still doing okay. And then as you go further south, did I mention that? All Pinot Noir, Riesling, Chardonnay, and up on the ridge, Cabernet Franc on the right, left, Merlot on the right, Pinot Grigio below that, all Pinot Noir and Riesling on the west side, east side, except about an acre of Gewürztraminer, and those special plants that they're not,
Peewee now,
the peewees, they're special, not genetically mutated, but treated in such manner that they still remain vinifera, but not susceptible to the same diseases they usually get. We'll see what happens with those. They're overseen by Cornell University and some Germans that have nurseries in the Finger Lakes region in New York. That's where we order all of our plants, from those guys.
Yeah. And so when you first started, I know you got some, like a loan. You had a note with Arnie. And how did you first meet Arnie?
Yeah, that was in the 80s when we were doing cherries, and Arnie bought the farm, this big cherry farm in those days, pushing 200 acres or so. Near the end of his first year of harvest, stuff went bad with his machinery. It wasn't working. And I had a shaker that bought stuff, that we needed for what we're doing here. And somehow or another we talked about it, and I said, well, let me go over there, I'll finish here. So I did. I went over there and finished what he had to do, and that's all. It wasn't a question of a contract or anything like that, just a favor. And he liked that, and we grew close to each other. We ended up both at the same parish here at St. Francis or St. Joe's, and got to mingle back and forth and become friends.
Mm-hmm.
He was quite wealthy. He worked with
Polaris. Polaris.
Polaris.
Right.
Yeah, he became head of manufacturing for that in Minnesota, way up by the snow there in Canada, and developed a higher end machine with some Japanese people with the Polaris.
So I know he did like a loan, and that helped buy some of the equipment in the cellar.
In '93, I was the sole owner.
Okay.
It was in 2003 we did an IPO, and I had the idea. This is in the '80s of doing what we're going to do. I said, we're somewhere along the line we're going to need a winemaker, as we set up '93 for the first building. And all I remember, we did contact back and forth on how do you do this.
Mm-hmm.
Mark knew everything.
Mm-hmm.
Mark was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. And well, you know the story, and I think I mentioned it downstairs. We were talking about the still downstairs. His position, his going from MSU to Germany, marrying a German girl, spending about 10 years there, ending up finally with a 3-year course in winemaking at Geisenheim, University of Wiesbaden, and then coming over with Chateau Grand Traverse. And around that time, I remember communicating with, I forget how, letters or something. And I remember communicating with him there, probably more times than that. But it was kind of quiet.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly related to, what do you do with it? How do you plant this and this and this?
Mm-hmm.
And we were licensed to make wine, but we were not licensed to sell it. And we made 12 1,500-gallon tanks, 15 more than that, and kept them in a warehouse about a mile north of here until '93, when the first building was built. That included not only the house that we're living in upstairs and moved to, but the cellar that was the beginning of the winemaking. And we had those 12 tanks over at the warehouse, Si tu parles français, c'est Rue de Vert, Street of Wine. That's our address.
Right.
Because it took 1,500 gallons of.
Well, and I remember Nadine talking about, I know when the tank tipped over, it didn't just tip over the tank, tipped over the whole truck with you in it.
It was.
So, like I said, one of the big things I've always admired is sort of the way that you just pivot, when something needs to be changed. But, what lessons do you share from your experience with companies? There's so many.
Yeah. The things that come to mind, and there's probably much more than that, is I've mentioned this before, that somebody gave me a shirt that has this Latin saying on it. I never wear it anymore, but I remember it. It's fortuna favet mentem paratam, that fortuna, good luck, success, mm-hmm. depends on a prepared mind. Fix your mind. If you're on it, don't quit. You think you believe in it, stay with it. Mm-hmm. And those things, and the whole question of metanoia, going from one thing to another. But each time, I think it's something you kind of wanted to do. There was nothing negative about it, and somehow it works out. Don't quit.
One of the questions here: what are your thoughts on legacy? The word legacy.
Yeah. Well, the core, I guess, is it's up to Marie. Certainly, anything that I have involved here would pass on to her, and her decisions to do what she wants to do. Either keep it up and pass it on to Luca. Mm-hmm. Who knows? I don't know. Right. I'll be past all of that. Personally, this last 2-week stint at the hospital and pavilions, I don't remember doing that before in my life. Mm-hmm. But there's stuff happening. I say, okay, I looked at it as kind of a retreat. And let me spend a week or so see if I can do what I did before with the conditions I'm in. If not, maybe what do I do? Do I put a seat on the stairwell going upstairs and automate it or something? and still be able to get downstairs and do tours, whatever, I've been doing without obviously the heavier work kind of thing. If I can still do that, I'd like to do that. If not, then the legacy is get the hell out.
Metanoia.
Metanoia. It's another change. Good word.
Yeah, right. What do you hope people remember about Chateau Chantal? And what do you hope for the...
Oh, gosh, I think my feeling with the bed and breakfast, for example, is an added personal invite. People come here, in part, 80% of them get out of their car and they go to the sign there that you designed with the logo part with Russell, and take a selfie or a picture of the scenery. They come here for the beauty of the place. Yeah, so a lot of come out to look out the window. But, people like yourself who are managers, that pass on to their subordinates a sense of dealing with guests or anyway, like family. And I think people have that kind of attitude in general about this place, liking it like family and getting along with personnel and so forth that way. And
there's sort of this hybrid between, family and you don't always get along with your family either. You got to put up with people and figure out where you are and be welcoming. And yet, it's all a balancing act. I think the other thing, we're just sort of thinking about stories of things that have happened over the years, or, what's kind of surprised you the most about starting and running the winery? Were there things that you didn't anticipate that?
Well, all kinds of, I guess. I don't know if I recall anything special. Well, yeah, that's constant. That happens at any time in the development of something. And even when it's going all right, you're going to find things that happen. One of the bigger ones, I suppose, was in 2003, the vinifera plants, you lose the buds at 15 below zero. They're good to about 8 or 10 below. And anything above that was like a hybrid, Marquettes. You'll take 25 below. You'll be able to see some of those grow in the UP, not down here. But most of the grapes, as you know, are along the water all the way down to the south end. And of course here with the bays on both sides. You lose them about 8 or 10 below, but that year it went down to 15 below. But at the graph node, right at the dirt level, where all the plants are grafted to a special rootstock, that year, every year, in fact, there are things that grow out in the grass, but they're actually vines. Well, you can't grow grapes in the grass. You cut them out with a herbicide or cut them. But that year it was virtually the only ones alive, and they're buds growing out in the grass. We waited for 2 of them to grow out long enough and strong enough, pick them up, tied them to the first wire, and about 70% of the trunks on all the plants, we cut them. And that became the new vine growing out of the old trunk. Mm-hmm. And it took about 3 years to get back into production again, but it was cheaper to go to the San Joaquin Valley in California, where they kick out 12 to 15 tons per the acre, and buy it in a truck and send it over here, then grow your own. And if we get 3 tons to the acre, we're happy. Weather differences, that create that. So after 3 years, we were back in production again. And those plants, the ones out here especially, they're 36 years old.
Right.
And they're still going.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yes.
Blessing of the blossoms. Bene Dixio. Speak well of. Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah. Amen.
Hallelujah. Thanks for this.